Here, this is an exciting festival because it's the 90th anniversary of Pan American. It coincides with the 90th anniversary of Pan American Center. For 9 decades, our Penn Center, the largest of the 144 branches around the world, has not only been instrumental in freeing hundreds of writers imprisoned for their words, but also defending freedom of expression by making sure all voices get to be heard through demonstrating to the incarcerated how writing can be a powerful tool for living, as well as increasing national readership. It is Pan American Center's belief that writing of all kinds, the plays, essays, and novels of our name, as well as poems and graphic art, provides a survival kit for living. The 2012 World Voices Festival explores this idea. Events throughout the week will strive to ask the question, what else to do literature? Beyond just what else to do with literature, I'm sure they meant, beyond just read it in an effort to understand how we can use the written word to become better people and even make a better society. Mr. Jagielski's books will be available for sale at the table outside, where the author will be available to sign copies, as you've just heard. And before, this part was for you to read, and I'll just get into the questions now. With that grand context, I'd like to mostly focus on your new book about Uganda, The Night Wanderers, which you may know has been given a new sort of boost, some new attention from this Kony 2012 video, which I'm sure you've seen.
Yeah.
Have you taken a critical look? Have you watched the whole thing?
Not the whole thing, but of course I'm aware of this video and the phenomenon. I remember when the day that the video appeared, I was called by one of the Polish TV station, and they wanted me to come to comment on this campaign. And I was so surprised. I didn't know what to say and what kind of comments I should give them. I was very surprised that this video and this campaign started right now, not 5 years ago, not in 5 years ago. And I refused. I said that I do not have anything to say. I do not want to comment things which are happening on internet, in this unreal world, that I'm not part of it. But then I thought that it's not about the internet and not about the invisible children, it's about Uganda. And even not about Uganda, it's about the LRA, a very unique guerrilla army, and it was worth to say something. So I regret that I refused to come to TV. Then when I heard about the campaign, when I saw the film, of course I have two kinds of feeling. First was to be critical, because I find it very naive, and very noble, very human, but naive. And not all information which were coming from the film were 100% true today. But on the other hand, I thought that it was an idea and campaign very worth to support, because it targeted criminal, and the criminal should be punished, and he's still free, and I don't know, he's not awaiting punishment, but I hope that the punishment awaits him. And if this campaign in any sense would help to capture Joseph Kony, the creator and the leader of Lord's Resistance Army, it would be only good. So from the heart I support 100%. From my mind I would say that I see some minuses, but these minuses have very little meaning comparing with this main idea.
Well, I don't mean to pick on what you said earlier, but I'm going to have to call you out on your claim that you're not good at English, because you
will see. You will see.
Said something really eloquent when you flipped around. He's not waiting for justice, but I hope justice awaits him. That shows that you were being humble. But just to frame this properly, how many people have died in the sort of tide conflicts that Uganda has undergone over the past decades?
I think that nobody knows real numbers. You can say 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, probably all the numbers are good enough. The problem with this war in Uganda was that it was a very local war. Only two countries were interested and involved in this war, Sudan and Uganda. And it was the border war. So the war was important for northern part of Uganda, but not for Kampala, the capital of Uganda, not that much important. The same in Sudan. Sudan was supporting Lord Resistance Army and Joseph Kony not because they share the same ideas, but because Sudan wanted to harm Uganda. And they wanted to harm Uganda because Uganda was supporting Sudanese guerrillas fighting Khartoum government. So nobody cared about that war in northern Uganda. It was not even the regional war. There is nothing strategic in this war. Nobody was endangered by this war. So nobody really counted the numbers. And northern Uganda is the poorest part of this country. And it suffered a lot. I think that, well, last year, Uganda suffered a lot during recent history, but northern part of Uganda suffered maybe not the most, but is the last victim of the wars that were happening in Uganda in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s. So the people in northern Uganda were trying to survive. They were not caring that much about the statistics. And I think that they didn't realize what is really going on, even in their own country, in their own districts, and how important it is, how big it is. They were trying to survive, and that was the only thing that really mattered.
Let me try to provide some context here because, as is probably entirely evident to the audience here, we're two white guys, once again, weighing in on Africa's problems. And you mentioned Sudan, and some of the first events that my magazine that I work on, Guernica, involved itself with, partnered with PEN on were events involving Sudan. And we got very concerned about this problem, and then I read Mahmoud Mamdani. Have you met Mamdani?
No, unfortunately not. Mm-hmm.
Have you read his book, Saviors and Survivors? It was an interesting premise because what he was trying to do was to essentially say that Africa and Africans are clearly better equipped than Western outsiders, like the makers of the video Kony 2012, to solve their own problems, even if from the outside it seems like they're having trouble in some cases. But what he also went on to say was that the Save Darfur coalition was a huge attempt to change the subject from Iraq. And he looked at the numbers of the dead that Save Darfur were posting, and he showed at one point that it was going up and down like a flagpole. Eric Bates was one of the, I think that was his name, no. Eric, forgetting his last name, at Smith College, a literature professor who turned Darfur expert. And at one point it was up to 500,000, and then it was down to 100,000, and the numbers just kept switching. And Mamdani compared those numbers to the deaths in Iraq. And from that, he made this thesis that the Save Darfur movement, whether intended to be or not, really sapped the juices from the anti-Iraq war movement in the United States. So I want to ask you a little bit about your motivation for doing the book, which I understand came out of newspaper articles. But first, let's talk a little bit about this book in the context of your other book so that it doesn't seem like I'm placing you in a suspicious context that Mamdani might, that segue might imply. Tell me about your books and whether you are someone who just loves misery, you love it, it makes you feel there's meaning if you're reporting on this stuff. I mean, you've covered stuff much closer to home. So tell me about your books and the order that, just a few sentences, and then let's get into the
All right, my books are a result of my journalism, and I decided to be a journalist when I got interested in Africa. I cannot say what were the reasons that I was interested in Africa. I was too young maybe. But I wanted to write about Africa. When I joined my first job, Polish press agency, I got an offer that I could not refuse. They told me that I can write, of course, about Africa, but Africa was never a priority for any Polish media. So they sent me to former Soviet Union, and they told me that in Soviet Union I will be able to observe the processes that Ryszard Kapuscinski observed in Africa in '60s. It means decolonialization. It was the mid-'80s, so the word decolonialization and Soviet Union, it was difficult to join. But anyway, I was sent to the former Soviet Union, so that's how Caucasus and Transcaucasus came. They started to be my interest. When I realized that Central Asia, which was part of the Soviet Union, is only the part of the Central Asia, I went to Afghanistan, and I get addicted to Afghanistan for many years. I spent all '90s traveling and writing about Afghanistan. So now you have the areas of my interest, and my first books were about Transcaucasus and Caucasus, because I spent first years of my journalism over there. Then came Afghanistan, and finally Africa. I wrote my first book about Africa is Uganda, Night Wanderers. A new book of mine is going to be published in 1 week in Poland, again about South Africa. And you're right, I agree with your Sudanese friend that it's strange that I wrote a book, for example, about the transformation in South Africa, political and social transformation, and why not about Polish transformation, which was more important for me, for us. I would say that it was my choice. I decided to be a foreign correspondent. I didn't want to write about Poland. It was easy choice because in the '80s, when we were the communist country, writing about Poland and politics in Poland, it was not a job for the journalist. It was the job for the politician, for the activist.
Yeah.
So if I wanted to be a journalist, the only area open to me was to be a foreign correspondent, and that's why Africa came.
Well, let me praise one thing that you did in the book. In the reaction to the Coney 2012 video, Teju Cole wrote in The Atlantic a piece that criticized this Western impulse to save places like Africa, and the title of the piece was "The White Savior Industrial Complex." And he was critical of this notion of distracting the local population from our problems, our corruption, our war in Iraq, and pointing outside. And you're doing that in a slightly different context. You're there reporting for a newspaper, and presumably you're there to inform the Polish public about what's going on in the world. And I don't think anyone can be critical of that. But what you do masterfully, and I think the second section of the book, you point to this, you're very critical of your own profession in the scene where you're talking about the foreign journalists interviewing all the local journalists, basically to exploit them and to steal their knowledge. So talk about that scene a little bit for people who haven't read the book.
Well, yeah, but it's a basic truth about the journalism, that we are using other journalists. If you come to Poland to do a research, first thing you would do, you would try to call Polish journalists to help you understand, to help you contact someone. I would do the same coming to New Mexico and writing a piece about Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. I planned this trip, so definitely I will try to find a journalist who are over there who can help me with something.
When you give that version, it sounds very straightforward, but the version in your book sounds a little more...
Yeah, but it's more probable that I will go to Uganda, and it's very rare that Ugandan journalists are coming to Poland. So I'm using them. Of course, I'm using them, and it cost me nothing. It should cost me at least something: a dinner, a lunch, or a salary for doing research.
Assisted in reporting byline.
Right, right. I agree with you, but it's a very unjust word, journalism. And the people, the local journalists who are hired by the representatives of the bigger media, I don't know if they are aware how much they are used by us or by them, because I do not consider myself and my newspaper and Polish press agency that I work for now, that we are a part of this elephants of the international media. We are not Reuters, we are not New York Times. Yeah, I mean, they are fixers for us. They are translators for us. They are teachers for us. And they are the people who stay in their own countries when we leave. So they pay the price very often for our experience, common experience. And we very rarely or never think about them that if they help us, our duty is to try to help them if they are in the trouble. It's very difficult and it is tough, but without their help, without their assistance, I think that our job would be more difficult.
Yeah.
How many days, how many weeks you will get for one travel to Iraq or Afghanistan?
Right.
And how many days you have to lose in Iraq, in Afghanistan or Uganda to find the proper person to talk?
Right.
So they are the first fixers and first fact checkers, because we are coming to these faraway countries with our knowledge, with our experience. But we need someone who will make this correction, who will tell us how it is really on the ground. So they are there.
Right. Yeah, it seems like you have these really compelling characters in the book, and those are sort of they form maybe a primary narrative, and then your secondary narrative has the context from these journalists whom you work with, who then themselves become characters. Let's talk about some of the compelling characters. Samuel is one who was actually conscripted into the Lord's Resistance Army. He was kidnapped from his village. Tell us a little bit of Samuel's story.
Samuel is a hero, but he was created. He has parts of other Samuels in.
I was wondering why Samuel was a composite character. Is
because
that just to make one common thread through the book?
First of all, it was necessary for me. Well, I thought it's necessary to have one character, one child soldier who would tell the story. And the other problem was difficulty to select one among dozens that I had a chance to meet. So I decided for such a thing. It's not maybe 100% according to the journalist rules, but I decided that it would be much better for the narration, for the book. It would be easier for me and maybe better to tell the whole story. It's not Samuel only. Nora is also my creation, and Jackson, local journalist, is the same. And Jackson is a creation. He's not only my other friends in Africa. In Jackson, I have also Chechen friends, Russian friends, Georgian, and the others. All the journalists who happened to help me during my trips, because we worked the same way. So Samuel, he's a representative of the children who were kidnapped in order to make them soldiers of Lord's Resistance Army. The scenario was always the same. In the night, the guerrillas were attacking a village. They were robbing the villagers of their food, and they were taking hostages, the children. It was not an accident, it was planned action. They wanted the children to be taken to the bush, not the adults, because it was easier to make this brainwash, to have children made, to be made a soldier. And I was even told that the best age for the children to be kidnapped, the best age to be a future guerrilla was 8 to 10 years. Enough grown up, enough strong, but too little to understand the limits or the borderlines between the bad and the evil. So in the bush they could be taught again what is good and what is bad. Lord's Resistance Army started as an ethnic army in northern Uganda during the civil war in the mid-80s. But then it became a kind of political, religious, military sect. Joseph Kony, at the very beginning, he pretended that he fight to defend the Acholi, the Acholi people from the northern Uganda, against the government from Kampala. But then it was the war for the war cause, I think.
Who was running Uganda when when this?
It started when Museveni took power in Kampala 1986. Before Museveni, it was two generals who were ruling very shortly in Uganda, and it happened that two of them were coming from Acholi people. And they came after Idi Amin and after Milton Obote, after very cruel civil wars in Uganda. So when those two generals were overthrown by Museveni, and when Museveni and his countrymen from the south took power in Kampala, the people in the north, and Acholi among them, they feared that they would be punished for all the evil things which were done to the southerners by the two generals. So they were expecting war, and the war came. But as I told you, the war was finished very quickly. I mean, the governmental army won, but Joseph Kony started to operate as a military sect. He didn't have, in my opinion, he never had a political program. Of course, he was telling people that he wants to reach Kampala and start a new order in Uganda, but more, he was rather a religious leader for these young children kidnapped. He was telling them about the Ten Commandments, that he's a prophet sent by the God to rule not only northern Uganda and Uganda, but all the world. He was telling them what is good, what is bad. It was like a religion. And the only way, there was no other way for him, and he even didn't try to recruit the soldiers like in other parts of Africa and other parts of the world. He was just kidnapping.
Taking them.
Yeah.
Let me pause you there and give a little context. Idi Amin, whom you mentioned earlier, is a well-known figure from Uganda in the West. There was the movie made about him. I don't know if you saw that, The Last King of Scotland. Idi Amin has claimed that the British essentially forced him into his service, the British Rifles or something like that.
He was a sergeant. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the role that the British may have played in terms of playing up ethnic divisions. You touch on it a little bit in your book.
Yeah,
Just
sure.
give us some context.
I mean, this is the history of Africa. There is no, even today, I would say, the African state with the natural borders. All African states were created by the European colonialists, except Ethiopia, although Ethiopia was also, it's not complete. Eritrea is not a part of Ethiopia anymore.
So it was more a spread of different peoples, different what we call tribes, and then the borders were carved.
In the territory was occupied by or taken by the European colonial power, and it was given the name, and then in the 60s it was given independence, and people who have very little common became the citizens of one state.
And in Uganda, who were the favored group by the British?
Uganda, British favored northern people for the army, but the southerners were ruling economy and politics. They were the leaders. So when Uganda became independent country, the first leader was Kabaka, the leader of Baganda people from the south. But the prime minister was from the north. It was the result, before it was divide and rule, and then the position in the government, it was the British idea that they should be shared among different groups in order to have kind of society joined by these positions and interests. But it very quickly appeared not only in Uganda, but in most of the African countries, that there is nothing that was joining them, just opposite. They were starting to fight. So the army dominated by the northerners were against the government, which was dominated by southerners. And again and again, Idi Amin overthrew Kabaka. He brought the power for himself, and he was from the north, so then he had an uprising in the south. Very complicated and very simple, I would say. this is the history not only about not only of Uganda. There are very few African countries that didn't that does not that do not have the experience of civil wars, coup d'états, rebellions, and so on.
So one of the points you made earlier was that you were surprised that that video was going viral now, and that's because you reported this all a long time ago. The election that you were reporting on took place
Even
what year?
before. I came to Uganda for research for the book 2006. It was the election time also in Uganda. But I was in Uganda also before, in the 90s. I was fascinated by Uganda from the very beginning. Thanks to Idi Amin, of course, although it was the stereotype who was created in Western media. Idi Amin, the real Idi Amin, was not the same person that we have from the movies, from the books. I think all the reasons for his behavior was also different. Then it was Ryszard Kapuściński who told me that he had a book. Idi Amin was supposed to be a third part of his books about the power. It was the Emperor, Shahin Shah, and Idi Amin was supposed to be the third, but he never wrote this book. So I was very interested in Uganda. In the 90s, when I was traveling to Congo, to Rwanda, I was trying to fix these trips in order to spend at least a couple of days in Kampala and in Uganda. So I was writing about Lord Resistance Army and about Uganda, and yeah, I was surprised not that the campaign started, but it started when the war is over in Uganda. And now figuring that Uganda is a country which is suffering a civil war, it's not the case. The war is somewhere else, and Joseph Kony is not in Uganda since 2003, 2004.
That was sort of the biggest mistake with the video, was that it was...
Yeah, but it was, on the other hand, I was also very critical, but on the other hand, it was not a journalist story, I would say.
It was not a...
It was not a journalist story. It was not a story to inform people about the details of the political situation of Uganda. I think that the reason for the campaign was to make people aware of existence of such a man like Joseph Kony, that he's still alive.
One of the filmmakers of the video was evangelical Christian, I believe.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
So I don't mean to jump forward too quickly, but what is the status with Ugandan politics? I mean, if that's what the video's big failing was to sort of tell us what's going on now. Tell us what's going on now.
Well, I mean, in Uganda, the life is stable, I would say. They are progressing in economy. The Kampala that I saw in the beginning of 90s is not a Kampala today. It's a big city with big problems, normal problems like all the big city have. The only problem I would say for Uganda, the big problem in politics is that President Museveni, who is ruling since 1986, he seems to want to rule forever. It always happened, or it's very often happened with the leaders who rule too long. They start to think.
You sound like you liked him when he first came to power.
Yeah, I like him still. I think that he was a very successful leader, and he made a lot of good things for Uganda. But he can lose all this stuff because the people will remember him not as a creator, but as someone who didn't want to leave government, who want to stay the president for life. So for the Ugandans who were born 20 years ago, Museveni is not a hero. They do not compare him with Obote, with Amin, with the failures. They see that in other, even African countries, the presidents are changing every 5 or 4 or 10 years, but they are changing. And in Uganda, is still the same guy who do all possible things not to lose any election. He changed the constitution, so the people complain. And I think that this is the big problem for Uganda, for Museveni, for Ugandans, because Africa is changing and Uganda is changing. You have the free election in Kenya, and well, they ended in the violence, but still the leaders are forced to quit by the vote of the people. And Ugandans are not that stupid. They see what is going on in the neighborhood, and they do not understand why they do not have the choice to select the leader. And well, it's a big mistake. And Museveni, I remember I've been told about one of his visits to see Nelson Mandela. And he was a favorite of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela considered Museveni as an example of a good leader for Africa. And Mandela was critical, and he was telling Museveni that he's ruling too long. And he was telling Mandela that he still has a lot of things to do. So he asked Museveni, Yoweri, how many years you are in power? He said 15. So if you are not able to do the things in 15 years, how many years you will need to do to finish this stuff? But I think, well, the power to be in the government, it's like narcotic things, I think. You got addicted, some people, and it's good to have this 4 years term, 5 years term, not only for the people, for the citizens, but for the politicians as well. It's a treatment or safety rule not to get addicted to power.
Yeah. Well, in the beginning, the thing that you seemed to commend him for was his relationship with accountability, and specifically, how has that eroded over his relation? You commended him for his relationship, positive relationship with accountability, and it seems like that has eroded as he's stayed in power longer. Specifically, how has that happened? What are the laws that he's either defying?
Well,
or
you know, the only thing that the people complain is that he's in power too long. He's not corrupted like other leaders. I mean, the corruption, I don't think that corruption in Uganda is a bigger problem than in other countries, not only in Africa. They are not political prisoners in Uganda. You have the free press in Uganda. But he behaved like the person who knows everything better. He's the only one who knows. And it's not the case. So this is the problem with Museveni, I think. He's blocking other people to compete with him.
You said that in the first election he stood in, it was about 75% voted for him, and then it was about 60%, and then it was just over 50%. Is there someone you're seeing who could challenge him?
Well, there's only one person who is always his rival is Kizza Besigye, but this is also the problem which arises from this political conflict. Museveni doesn't want to have anyone standing against him, so he's trying, how to say, he doesn't want any rivals to appear even among his own party. And this is the best experience of the party in Uganda because it is ruling for more than 25 years. So the best people to succeed him, I think, they are from his own political party. But how can you have a challenger from your own political party? So he's stopping these challenges. And the people from the opposition, maybe they are too long in the opposition to be prepared well to govern the country. Every election, whenever the elections are happening in Uganda, there are talks about the splits among the ruling party and possible rivals of Museveni. But finally, they decide that they will support Museveni because if there will be the division in the political party ruling, they risk to lose the power at all. So I don't know what is the future of Uganda and what will do Yoweri Museveni during another election. I'm afraid that he will try to run again.
So when your book came out, it came out in 2009 originally, and it was translated just out in the U.S. in February. Where else is it coming out?
Pardon?
Where else is it coming out?
It came out in Germany 2 years ago, and is to be published in Italy this year.
I don't know how we are on time. Almost 8, 10, 5 minutes to 8. So let's just very quickly talk about a few of the other characters in your book, which I think were interesting characters. We talked a little bit about Coney's belief in sort of religious ideas. Tell me a little bit about the history of these charismatic guerrilla leaders, maybe on whose shoulders Joseph Kony is standing, like Alice
Laquena. I met Alice Laquena, who created this army. It was the not Lot Resistance Army, it was a Holy Spirit movement. And it was from the very beginning religious army. Alice Laquena claimed that she was possessed by the spirit of Laquena, which was translated into Holy Spirit. It was this point that the local beliefs joined the Christianity. So it was said that Alice Laquena was possessed by the Holy Spirit. It's very complicated, and it was not easy. That's why I decided to write about this in the book and not like my journalistic reports, because it is not easy for the journalists to write about the ghosts and spirits in the news report and claim that they are the reasons for the conflict. But when I spent in 2006, when I spent more time in northern Uganda, I find out that there are the things that really matters. The people believe like this, and you have to take in your account these beliefs, how the conflict started, and what are the way for the reconciliation or for any way out. And the local beliefs were very important, and they were used by not but Alice Laquena, but especially by Joseph Kony to do the brainwash, to brainwash the children kidnapped for the guerrilla army. So dozens of things, the belief in the power of the natures when they cross the river, then do some rituals, power of mountain.
But yeah, let's stop on that for a second. How did Alice Laquena lose her animating spirit, or her?
Because she lost the war. I mean, when she started.
But the story was something to do with disrespect for the river.
Yeah, that's what it was said, that she lost the war because she disrespected the river when she and her soldiers were crossing the rivers, directing on Kampala, because they were very close to Kampala, and Alice Laquena was very close to reach the capital and maybe even to win the war with the governmental army. But she lost the big battle close to Kampala, and it was the explanation of the leaders of the guerrilla army that we lost the war, we lost the battle because of Alice Laquena, because she disrespected the power of the spirits. I think that they wanted to get rid of her also, so they accused her of doing evil things. It was easy way to get rid of her, that she's not possessed anymore, that Laquena left her because she disrespected even Laquena himself. So she lost the leadership of the movement, and then the others came.
You make it clear that there's a very sort of severe difference in how the world is explained in the north versus in the capital, and it's just, it comes up through as just a question of urbanity and sophistication. You have the two journalists in one scene. You have your fixer Jackson explaining that the spirits are real that change Kony's personality. How many spirits supposedly animate him?
Oh, dozens.
These are just his moods, basically. But he has thousands of spirits which animate him. And then Eddie, the other journalist, who's much better known, I take it, who's based in Kampala.
Very westernized, and
What's his explanation for the spirits and the?
Well, I think that
he blames it on Sudanese intelligence, essentially.
Yeah,
because it was.
I mean, I suspect that his attitude toward the ghosts depended on with whom he were talking. If he was talking to me, he was explaining the war with the political forces intelligence, and I mean, he was explaining the conflict of the categories from our part of the world. And well, I believe that he did not believe in the spirits as a main reason for the war and the main helpers.
In that context, it was the reason that Coney was sort of invincible. He knew everything from the spirits. And Eddie just cuts through it and says, actually, it was Sudanese intelligence.
It was Sudanese intelligence, yeah.
Now, you said something about this difference having to do with our world and theirs. Let me read you one quote, if I may. President George W. Bush told Palestinian ministers that God had told him to invade Afghanistan and Iraq and create a Palestinian state, a new BBC series reveals. In Elusive Peace, Israel...
Again, it's Sudanese intelligence.
The source, Nabil Shah, says, this is on the BBC website, President Bush said to all of us, I'm driven with a mission from God. God would tell me, George, go and fight those terrorists in Afghanistan. And I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq. And I did. And now again, I feel God's words coming to me. Go get the Palestinians their state and get the Israelis their security and get peace in the Middle East. And by God, I'm going to do it.
I can only applaud.
Well, it's probably important to note that Poland sent troops for the Iraq War. Is that right?
Yeah.
How many were sent?
About 2,000 or 3,000.
And did they stay very long?
Whole war till the end. Now we have troops in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to offer those little bits of context. It's a wonderful book. It's very, very exciting to read, and I wanted to add to those places where you did the same thing by showing the dynamic between the journalists. I mean, there's just so much sort of sensational reporting in there, and then it gets into the spirits, but then you sort of show the contrast between the different beliefs, and I want to commend that, and once again welcome you to Brooklyn and Penn World Voices, and I think we're going to open this up now to audience questions.
And if you would wait for me to come to you with a microphone so that everyone can understand you. And for those of you who speak Polish and English, if I can prevail upon you to ask your question in English, we would appreciate it, us English speakers.
I have absolutely no Polish, so that's fine with me. I wanted to ask you, you had said that there was a difficulty to select one among the dozens of child soldiers as the main character for the book, and that's what results in your composite. Could you tell us specifically what that difficulty or difficulties were? Was it that the biographies didn't match up in any one individual, the points you wanted to hit, or you felt bad picking just one? Or I'm interested in the specifics of that.
I've had two kinds of problems. First was the difficulty to select the biography. Tragic things happened to all of them, and I was looking for one character, for one boy or one girl who could be a character for this book. But selecting one, I had to disqualify others. So what about the things that happened to them? They were very important, and I wanted to show all these things. I didn't want to have a dozen of characters in these books. So this was first reason. And another one was very personal, I would say. I didn't want to select one of them. I think that I'm afraid that I became too close to them. And for me to making this selection was not a sin, but I thought it was wrong to select one of them only. But main reason was their biographies. I wanted to have all biographies in one. Thank you.
You said that you spent a lot of time in Uganda for many, many years. What kind of language challenges did you have? Do they all speak English in the north and the south? Did you have translators with you all the time? How did you learn so much information with the language challenges?
The information I got, it's the result of more than 20 years of interest. I'm reading for 20 years everything possible about Africa, all the news reports, the newspapers who are now available on the internet, the books. They speak English. so I can communicate with them. But I do not speak any local languages, so I needed translators if I go to some villages. Even with the translator, it's not the same conversation. I remember in South Africa when I was taken by one of my friends to go to Zululand to interview one of the Zulu leader, Mangosuthu Buthelezi. And after this interview, this journalist took me to his village. And he introduced me to the chief of the village. And we had a conversation, whole night almost. But we were speaking in English. And I was really happy with this conversation and the Zulusness and the culture and the histories, anecdotes. And I thanked my friend from Johannesburg for taking me to his village and for introducing me and for having this conversation. And I told him that it was great. And he said, yeah, it was quite good. I said, how it was quite good? It was great. I mean, great it would be if you would understand Zulu. So, even speaking about the same, I mean, you have to speak your first language. English is not my first language. So, to really understand each other, especially when we talk about such things like beliefs, spirits, emotions, first language is really very helpful. So, even with the translator, it's not the same. So, I realize how many things, how many stories I lost because I do not speak the local languages. But how many languages you can speak? Thank you.
Everything you're talking about here is very close to my heart because I spent 3 years in Uganda. I actually just got back 2 weeks ago. But I wanted to ask you about your choice for the story for your book, because you mentioned yourself you'd been to Uganda so many times. You went there in the 90s.
Can you speak a
Speak
little
louder,
closer?
please.
You spent so much time in Uganda in the 90s, and you've been witnessing the transformation the country has been going through. So why did you pick a story that, to me, propels this image of Africa that we in the North like to portray, while the Africa is trying to get rid of the story of child soldiers, the rebels, the guerrilla war, which at that time when you were writing the book was coming to an end, at least in Uganda. So why pick that story and not something else from Uganda?
Well, for me, it is easy explanation, because I was so occupied in the 90s with the former Soviet Union and then Afghanistan that the first books were about these countries. I decided to write Night Wanderers not because of the political calendar of Africa or Uganda. It was I thought about this for many years, but I didn't get enough material. I didn't have a chance to spend the time in Gulu for research. So it just happened that after Afghanistan, after Caucasus, I started to be interested more in Africa again. And Uganda, I don't know. First I thought that I will write a book about the child soldiers from Uganda, from Congo, from Sudan, Liberia. I decided to start with Uganda because there were already books published about the child soldiers in Liberia. And then when I arrived in Gulu, I realized that it's impossible to write a book about the child soldiers because there is no way to communicate with them. It's a language problem, but first of all, the problem is how to communicate with between the adult person like me and the children who have very adult experience. And how can they tell me? So I decided that the only way I can write this book is about this problem of, I would say, it's about the miscommunication. If I got your point properly, is you asked me why I wrote a book about the child soldiers when the Africa is trying to get rid of this phenomenon? No.
Not a phenomenon, but this image that
And the image. Right, right. I agree with you. I mean, this is the problem of our journalists. It's not us who made the choices to go there and there. We go where we are sent, usually. And the truth is also, not only in Poland, I think in US media the same, that the medias are more interested in the horrors that in the romantic comedies. So we, on one hand, personally, one of my main reason to be a journalist, to write about Africa, was to kill the stereotype of Africa functioning in Poland for many years. The stereotype which tells that Africa is suffering on AIDS, all possible diseases, that it's murdering itself in the ethnic wars and hunger and all this stuff. And I wanted to write that Africa, that such things are happening in Africa, but not all Africa is like this. But when they were sending me to Africa, they were sending me not to Ghana to write about the progress, economical progress, but they would send me to Congo when another war started there. In Uganda, they didn't want to send me in Uganda at all, because the Uganda was a progressive country. My newspaper wanted me to spend more time in Sudan or in Rwanda or in Somalia. So this is, I wouldn't use the word tragedy, it's irony, I would say. And it's also written in our job, in our profession, that we are trying to write stories that would tell the truth about the continent, about the country, about the whole truth, and to kill the stereotype. But on the other hand, the selection of the subjects of our journalist trips, the result is quite opposite. And my book about Uganda appeared in Poland in 2009 when the war in Uganda was over. I would tell you more. My book about Georgia appeared in Poland in mid-90s, and the people are again calling me if it is safe to go to Georgia. But what can I do?
I appreciate
I should write another book about Georgia, how it is progressing, maybe. I don't know.
I have two questions. The first one, this was something that was mentioned in the beginning, but I don't think you had a chance to respond to it. Could you please respond to Mamdani's critique about the involvement of the West in Africa and African problems? And I'm curious what you think about what he's been writing about that lately. And the second question that I have is I'd like to know what you think about the International Criminal Court campaign and their attempt to arrest Kony, and what you think in general about their involvement in Uganda and in this case.
Well, I support only the idea to capture criminals and to punish them. I wouldn't say it's very effective, this campaign. The only people who were arrested and sent to Hague, they are the people who lost political battles. So it's for the other ones, the lesson is that you cannot lose your political battle, because then you will be arrested and sent to Hague. Jean-Pierre Bemba, the guy who was a vice president of Congo, and then he was a candidate in the election. He lost the election, so he was arrested and sent to Hague. If he won in Hague, we would have Joseph Kabila, I think. So for them, they will fight as hard as it is possible not to lose power. The same is with President of Sudan. The process of Charles Taylor, who will be sentenced, I guess, because of the crimes committed in Sierra Leone, not by the International Criminal Court, but by the court created to judge the crimes in Sierra Leone. It's also a lesson for Omar al-Bashir, because he's safe when he's a president. But Charles Taylor, before there was no former presidents sentenced, so it's also the lesson for him. About Western involvement in Africa, I think that we are trying very hard to do the good things. Our problem is that we do not think about asking, consulting the local people, is this really what they want? And we are doing this. I think that one of the reasons that we are trying to help is to make ourselves more happy, that we are a good people if we SMS on this and this number, or we send some email. For us, it's a proof that we are helping, so we are good. I do not have too big experience observing humanitarian activity in Africa, but I had the experience observing what was going on with this help in Afghanistan, and it's such a loss of money and opportunity. The result is just opposite. And in Afghanistan, it was complete failure. I think that I talked with many engineers and NGOs workers in Africa and elsewhere, and I believe them that they are coming to these countries and they want to share the best things that we have in the West, democracy, for example, or anything. But not everyone is prepared to receive such a gifts. And you have to take care, you have to think about this. That doesn't mean that they are worse, that they are not prepared, but how to say, if it is the same, if you will offer me the car fully automatic, computerized, and I'm not prepared to ride this car properly. I think that, you know, we are not thinking, there is a lack of reflection in the West when we are going to help other countries. We do not even think, because sometimes help hurts. If you give grain to someone, you do not realize that you are sometimes killing agriculture in this country.
Can I try to connect the two questions? Mamdani himself is against the International Criminal Court because he says it can virtually never prosecute, for instance, Westerners. Do you believe that the Bush and his coalition, which included Polish soldiers, do you believe that they committed war crimes in Iraq?
Well, there are war crimes in Iraq and in Afghanistan. There's no doubt about this. You read it in the newspaper.
So Mamdani's critique was that despite that, there's virtually no way that the way it's set up within
the U.S. is not a part of
it
International Criminal Court, so nobody from U.S. can be charged, I think, by this court. Yes, the impression in Africa is that this International Criminal Court is occurred to judge Africans only, because there are only Africans in Hague awaiting their processes, their trials. You have former president of Ivory Coast, many rebels. Now, if Connie would be captured, will be another. I don't know if there are any, how to say this, wanted lists for leaders from other continents.
I mean, procedurally, it can either come from the country itself or the Security Council. Either way, the powers, the big Western powers, and Russia and China are basically exempt. So that was his critique.
Yeah.
But let's see if we can make some room for any other questions.
Yeah, do we have?
I'm curious about how you see the role of journalists. When I was listening to you, two journalists came to my mind, American journalists that travel a lot, Thomas Friedman and Nicholas, Christoph. One looks microscopically, another from the bird view. These two fellows are trying to inform American public about what goes on, and they influence American public, politicians. You are writing for Polish audience. You want Polish audience to know. The influence, the feedback, if you wish, is probably non-existent. Those are the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how do you see the role of a journalist?
Well, I always saw the role of journalist as a kind of messenger. At the beginning of my career, I had the impression that I was the messenger who was bringing information about the outside world. But it was a time when I was traveling with the sat phone or without the sat phone, when I sending the story, I had to use the local telephone booths or telexes. So it's like it was travelers, especially for such countries like Congo, Sudan, or Afghanistan, without the communication equipment. It was really strange and difficult journeys, but I've got the impression that I was coming back with something to share with my readers. Recently, I think that the only role for us journalists is to make a selection of the information. There is a rivers of information falling on us. So our job is to select what is important, what has any meaning, or what is just rubbish. Try to analyze, to help our readers to find out sense in these rivers, oceans of information. And I think it's the only role for us, because in the modern world, it's impossible to be on time. I mean, you have always local people who can tell you something, who can do the story for any newspaper in the world. But that's how I see the role of the journalist, the selection. We are the helpers. And you mentioned these two ways of doing journalism. I tried always to be this microscope. It is because of maybe my friendship with Ryszard Kapuściński, who was doing this kind of journalism. He was a guru for me, and I was trying to observe how he's working. But I think that doing this micro-observation, you can also show something bigger. And this is, I think, that the most important thing in this journalism that I'm trying to do. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that if there are no more questions, this would be a good time to close. I want you all to have time to buy your books and have your books signed. Gentlemen, thank you both for such a wonderful conversation.